Looking skyward on a June day in 1945, Muscovites saw a huge four-engine aircraft enter a shallow bank for a landing at Izmayovo, a restricted sector in the northeast quadrant of Moscow where the Soviet Navy's flight test facility was located. Startled onlookers watched the behemoth aircraft lower its landing gear for final approach. Red stars on the wings and fuselage signified that the intruder was friendly, though eagle-eyed observers might have noticed the English words, "Ramp Tramp," on the nose section. Ramp Tramp first entered Soviet territory while returning from a raid in Manchuria. Geryl's crew experienced electrical system problems, so Geryl headed toward Vladivostok, where he naively assumed that he and his crew would be allowed to fly home as soon as the bomber could be repaired and refueled. Like many U.S. airmen, he thought the Soviets, then allies in the war against Germany, would welcome him and his crew. But Vladivostok proved to be hostile territory. Ever since Edward York landed his B-25 at Vladivostok after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942, all U.S. aircraft penetrating Soviet airspace in the Far East had been confiscated. After landing in Vladivostok, Geryl never saw the airplane again. He and his crew members joined other interned airmen in a camp in Central Asia, where they remained for months, prior to being repatriated through Iran. Washington quietly acquiesced to the confiscation of the B-29s and kept the matter under wraps. There was no concerted diplomatic effort to gain their return, as maintaining cordial relations with Moscow was a high priority for the United States throughout World War II. The War Department even asked returning interned airmen to keep silent about their sojourn in the Soviet Union. However, during 1944 and 1945 deep differences and conflicting interests began to surface among the Allies, and these would shape the character of the war. If relations with Moscow were difficult in 1944, they deteriorated further as the Allies advanced into Nazi Germany in 1945. The Allied conferences at Yalta and Potsdam in 1945 only sharpened a growing estrangement between the United States and the Soviet Union. Consequently, the transfer of 3 B-29s to the Soviets at Vladivostok became a fait accompli. No one in Washington could have anticipated that these same aircraft would play a critical role in the transformation of Soviet air power within 2 years. Ramp Tramp was flown to Izmayovo because Soviet leader Josef Stalin wanted a B-29 to serve as a template for a new heavy bomber to be produced in massive numbers in just 2 years, the Tu-4. Such a high-stakes scheme in technology transfer, if successful, would recast the Soviet Air Force into a strategic air arm and pave the way for military parity with the West in the uneasy peace that followed World War II. By copying the B-29, the Soviets would have an intercontinental bomber capable of striking New York City and the industrial heartland of the United States, and in a fraction of the time it would take them to develop their own design. The first time the Soviets got any public word of the B-29 was on the occasion of a visit by famed American ace Eddie Rickenbacker in 1942. Rickenbacker, who spoke openly about the new bomber, only confirmed what Soviet intelligence already knew. Stalin had made 3 overtures to the United States under the Lend Lease Act, a U.S. program launched in 1941 to provide material to friendly nations, to get B-29s as part of a general initiative to obtain heavy bombers. Washington rejected all requests for the heavies, but was generous with medium bombers, fighters, and transports. Soviet air power surpassed the Luftwaffe to become the most lethal tactical air arm of World War II. But the Soviets were utterly lacking in strategic capability. Estimates said they could muster only 32 serviceable 4-engine bombers, the outmoded and highly unreliable PE-8. They therefore viewed the unexpected arrival of 3 B-29s on their soil as an extraordinary windfall. Soviet air planners, and Stalin himself, had been impressed with the Allied bombing of Germany, and the B-29 pointed to the importance of strategic aviation in any future war. Now the interned aircraft offered the Soviets their first opportunity to examine the most advanced U.S. bomber firsthand. Stalin ordered Admiral Nikolai G. Kuznetsov, People's Commissar for Naval Affairs and commander of the Soviet Navy, to begin flight tests. Kuznetsov, awestruck, sent Moscow an enthusiastic report. The lavish use of lightweight aluminum alloys, pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled guns, powerful supercharged engines, Norden bomb sight, radar, electronics, and instrumentation, all represented an advanced level of technology beyond Soviet industry's reach. Such reports only strengthened Stalin's resolve to create a strategic air arm, and he called for the transfer of Ramp Tramp to Moscow. Accordingly, on June 22, 1945, the Soviets formally launched the B-4 program, bomber with 4 engines. The B-4 was to be an exact copy of the B-29 Superfortress. Stalin simultaneously cancelled the Airplane 64 program, a new long-range bomber project that had been launched in January 1945 with Andrei Tupolev as lead designer. Tupolev initially thought the effort to copy the B-29 would be foolhardy. He was more confident that his own Airplane 64 had greater potential to surpass the B-29 in critical categories of range and payload. Tupolev wanted to incorporate the West's latest technology in an airplane that would represent the maturing technological expertise of the Soviet system. On this crucial matter he did not prevail, although the new B-4 bomber eventually bore the name Tupolev. Stalin demanded that his new bomber be an exact copy of the B-29 because he wisely understood that even one concession would lead to a cascade of modifications, and any request to depart from this discipline would slow the process. Eager to maintain formal compliance with Stalin's order, Tupolev chose not to take the mandate literally despite the presence of the secret police and the possibility of denunciation, reasoning that Stalin's order pointed more toward ends than means. While Tupolev remained attentive to certain external cosmetic flourishes to suggest strict compliance with Stalin's order for an exact copy, for example, a repair patch in the fuselage was included and the interior paint scheme duplicated exactly, he often went his own way on the more critical, less obvious components. Stalin's acquiescence on the matter of using the metric system had been a major concession. Other concessions followed in engines, radar, and armament. If the airplane can be thought of as having a genetic code, the dominant genes were Boeing's, and the recessive genes were Tupolev's. Some duplication efforts led to surprising successes. One of the more complex units on a B-29 was the Central Station Fire Control System, the computerized remote firing system. Gun sights and controls were located with the gunners in plexiglass blisters and were linked electronically to remote turrets housing the guns. The system incorporated complex circuitry and switches that enabled any B-29 gunner to control any of the gun turrets that he could aim properly. The Soviets devoted their considerable talent and energy to this system. They succeeded, to the amazement of the consternation of observers in the West, who believed this advanced system was beyond the capacity of the Soviets. No less important was the decision to substitute the Soviet NS-23 cannon for the original .50 caliber machine guns, another concession approved by Stalin. Tupolev also contended with a bomb bay that was larger than any produced in the Soviet Union. And there were enormous problems with the system that actuated the undercarriage, along with the inability of the Soviet aviation industry to produce the oversized tires for the landing gear. When faced with the task of copying the B-29's large tires and complex gear, the Soviets used a unique approach. Agents were sent to the West to purchase them on the war surplus market. Many myths have arisen in the West about how the Soviets built the Tu-4. Over the decades, stories have circulated that the B-29 was copied in exacting and often ludicrous ways. These tales suggest that Tupolev and his team mindlessly replicated every aspect of the Boeing design. As noted, Tupolev did approve the precise copying of such details as a fuselage patch and the exact hue of the interior paint scheme found on Ramp Tramp. Some rumors circulated that even flak damage on the wings had been carefully copied, but such stories exaggerate what actually happened. Tupolev had to contend with the legendary bureaucratic inertia associated with the aviation industry. For decades, Soviet designers had come up with excellent aircraft designs, even prototypes, only to see serial production fall short of the design standards. Soviet aviation plants had trouble sustaining quality control in the mass production of aircraft. The more complex the aircraft, the more disappointing the result. It was easier in the war years to build huge numbers of military aircraft of simple design, such as 33,000 Ilyushin IL-2 ground attack aircraft known for their sturdiness and austere instrumentation. The Tu-4 demanded a level of sophistication at odds with decades of industrial practice, and to a degree no Westerner might have expected. The Soviets succeeded. The first batch of Tu-4s rolled off the assembly line on schedule in 1947, less than 2 years after the project was launched, an incredible feat. The Tu-4 made its public debut on Aviation Day in August 1947, at Moscow's Tushino airfield. Foreign observers, including the Western powers, were all invited. 3 Tu-4s, followed by a Tu-70 passenger version, flew by at 600 feet. When the Western observers counted 3 bombers, they assumed the Soviets were flying the long-lost interned B-29s. But the appearance of the Tu-70 passenger plane clearly indicated that the Soviets were flying freshly cloned B-29s. This carefully staged event became a headline story in Western newspapers. The Tu-4 became truly operational in 1948 and 1949, as production reached full capacity. During the Korean War, the number of Tu-4 bombers increased dramatically, reached at 845 aircraft. The Soviets detonated their first nuclear device from a tower on August 29, 1949. As soon as they perfected the bomb, Stalin approved high-priority experiments to adapt the Tu-4 as its airborne delivery system. On October 18, 1951, a Tu-4 bomber dropped an atomic bomb near Semipalatinsk. This confirmed the Soviet Union's enhanced capabilities in strategic aviation. The West reacted with increasing alarm. The Tu-4 never possessed the range to pose a real threat to the United States. Only a one-way mission could threaten Chicago or New York City, but the very existence of the Tu-4 and its jet-powered successors prompted the United States to set up an array of defensive systems. Ramp-Tramp flew for nearly a decade, and soon acquired a legendary status among bomber crews as the progenitor of the Soviet strategic air arm in the early years of the Cold War. But despite numerous upgrades, Ramp-Tramp was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. By 1954, the Tu-4 fleet was gradually being dismantled. Today, at the Menino Air Museum outside Moscow, a lone Tu-4 bomber stands outside on display, the sole reminder of a turbulent time. Stalin's decision to copy the B-29 allowed the Soviet Union to acquire an interim long-range bomber, if not a true intercontinental strategic weapon. The Tu-4 enabled the Soviets to project power credibly on the front side of the Cold War, at a time when the worsening relations with the United States and the advent of nuclear weapons posed what they perceived as serious threats to their national survival. There was a second aspect to these events. The Tu-4 project became the pathway for the rapid modernization of the Soviet aviation industry and gave expression to Stalin's larger purpose, providing for Soviet national security, even military parity with the West. Stalin reorganized Soviet aviation for the post-war environment, compelling it to adopt a range of new technologies, materials, and techniques of manufacture. Technological inferiority persisted, but the baseline for a more sophisticated aviation sector had been established. In its own way, Ramp-Tramp had offered the Soviet Union a trajectory to the future. This is all for today's video. If you like our content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss our future content.